Hi and welcome back to another tutorial. Today I'm going to be experimenting with the wet in wet technique, and I'm going to be trying out some freshly ground salt to see what sort of effects it gives me in the wet in wet painting. I'm using Milford paper. It's £140, it's cold pressed. My board is at an angle of about 45 degrees and the paper is taped with masking tape. It's quarter imperial size. I'm just going to paint a simple landscape using a limited palette of two colours. I'm going to use Paynes grey and yellow ochre. I'm just going to wet my paper mostly in the sky. I'll flick some water at it to see if it will give me some variation, but mostly what I just want to do is to paint very fast, very loose, and just see what effect the salt will have in the foreground. I'm not going to mess around with subtlety here. I'm just going to put in some nice dark paint across the top for the sky. That's the Paynes grey going in there, nice and thick, wet in wet, so it's just diffusing, running down the page a little bit and blending and diffusing nicely with the yellow ochre. I'm going to do the same for the foreground, just streak the paint across and just let it do its thing. Now I think that looks interesting, so I'm going to tilt it around and tip it just to keep the flow of the paint, wet in wet, running across the paper so that it ends up giving the impression of clouds scudding across the sky. I'm just going to just gently tweak it a bit with the hake brush, just so that it looks more pleasing to the eye. I don't want to mess around with it too much fiddling and it'll show. I like the skies when they look quite clean and simple, and I think this looks quite nice. I'll just wipe off any wet paint across the bottom with a tissue so I don't get any runbacks. Now I've turned it up the right way. It's still very wet all over, and I've ground up some natural rock salt crystals in a pestle and mortar, and now I'm just going to sprinkle them across the foreground, just sort of randomly, just in little groups. And I'm just going to leave it alone. I'm not going to do anything to it, because the point is to see what happens to it with just wet in wet paint and salt. I think the idea is that the salt repels the water and sort of creates effects, but with the Paynes grey, I think that it should split the Paynes grey into its black and blue components, the colours that it's made of. It's still damp. I'm going to take quite a rich mixture of Paynes grey on my large hake brush, and I'm going to put in some distant trees. If I put them in now, they'll diffuse quite nicely, but should still hold their shape because I'm using fairly thick paint, which should stay quite nicely where I put it on the sky area, on the horizon. I want them to sort of look, the trees to have a sort of, varied shapes so that they are quite interesting. Just a little bit smaller so it looks like they're a bit further back on the right side. Clean damp brush just to straighten off, soften off the bottom edge there a little bit. And now a few smaller trees on the left side. Keeping it nice and simple, just suggesting the shapes of trees. Now I think I just want to have a few trees here that look more like mid-ground trees, so I'm going to bring some dark paint a little bit lower down and then introduce some sort of impressions of trunks with the rigger brush at the base of those trees, and this straight away brings this group of trees a little bit further forward than the line of trees behind it, hopefully. Right, I think that'll do now. I think now it's a matter of leaving it to dry and then seeing what I think it needs doing to it. But that's the wet in wet phase, and it'll take quite a long time to dry because of the salt. But it's already looking very interesting. I can see some textures coming through quite nicely. One thing that I'm less keen on though is this mark. I'm not sure what happened, whether there was a scratch on the paper, but can you see there's a strange mark there right in the sort of where the eye is drawn to. So I'm probably going to have to do something with that a bit later on, but for now I'm going to leave it to dry. Okay, it's completely dry now, and what I've done is I want to cover up that mark somehow, but I don't want to commit to something straight away. I'm going to try a couple of things out. So I have used a fine liner and drawn out some winter trees and placed them on tracing paper and laid it over the top, and that looks okay, but I'm still not convinced that that's what I want. So I'm going to try something else. I'll try some slightly different shaped trees, and I'm going to paint them onto the tracing paper just to see if that helps. Now I like the look of that because those trees there are similar to the ones that we've already got in the distant line, tree line. So I think that's what I'm going to go for. This is a useful thing to do, is try it out. Try your ideas out on tracing paper before you actually paint them on. I'm going to use the Paynes grey and the large hake brush to start with. I'm just going to try and imitate the shapes that I drew or painted onto the tracing paper because I like those, and try and get the position right. I want these trees on the same sort of level as my mid-ground trees. Trying not to block the whole tree in so there's some light showing through. I'm using the medium hake brush now to put some darker paint around the base area, just to make them stand out a bit more. It's almost tube consistency now. Just touching it in around the middle and the bottom of the trees, maybe a little at the top, but not too much, because I want to keep the top of the trees lighter than the base. Right, that would do for the canopies. Now I'm using a rigger brush, and I'm going to bring the trunks down from the canopies, or up, from the point at which I want the trees to start, which is just the same sort of level as the other mid-ground trees. Just putting a few trunks in with the rigger brush. Just darken up a little bit more. Just get these trees to look balanced, because these are quite important. They kind of become the focal point really now. Just going to thicken the trunks up in places. I don't want them too thick though. And then I'm just going to use the paint that's on the rigger to run some shadows across the base underneath the trees, just to sort of settle them into the landscape a bit better. And then just adjust again with this dark paint a little bit more on the canopies. And I'm just going to just touch the hake brush in the shadows under the trees. I think that's just about done now, but finally I just want to soften the bottom with a clean, damp squirrel mop brush and soften across the base of those trees. And that's the finished painting, I think. Just maybe a couple of touches here, maybe a few little rigger suggestions of trunks and branches just over on this side, nothing too much, just a little bit of something and nothing. Now it's time to remove the masking tape and see how it looks with a nice clean white border. Well, for a quick painting, I think that looks quite nice. I think the effect that the salt has given us, the texture and the colour and the shading and the patterns that it's given us is amazing, because remember I did virtually nothing to the foreground whatsoever. The wet in wet trees look quite effective, but now if you look at the detail and the patterns that the salt has given us, I mean, the salt has split the Paynes grey into blue and black in places, because remember all I've used is Paynes grey and yellow ochre for this painting, and yet we have blue there. So I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you'll give it a try and try out salt in your wet in wet painting. It's so much fun to experiment with. So thank you so much for watching, and please like and subscribe, and thanks so much to my patrons on Patreon who support me. Thank you so much, and I'll see you again soon. Bye.